ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Farah Kilidar, and I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council. Before we start our program today, I would like to welcome and recognize members of the Consular Corps. I believe we've got the Consul General of Ghana and the Consul General of Germany and Turkey. Farhad, you made it, so welcome, please. I would also like to thank Schlumberger, and more specifically Dan Damaraki, who is on the board of the World Affairs Council, for supporting this event and for their continued support of our education program. Thank you. Going on to our program today, I would like to introduce Ambassador Ross, who is the Wilson Davidson Distinguished Fellow. I had to repeat that before to really get it. The Wilson Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. A highly skilled diplomat, Ambassador Ross was the U.S. point man for the peace process in both the George W.H. Bush and the Clinton administrations, a rare breed in today's politics. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 Interim Agreement. He also brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. It is a true pleasure to welcome Ambassador Ross to the podium today.
Thank you. Okay, so this is working, yeah? So I can walk and talk at the same time? I like to do that. First, I teach, and I find that when I'm walking and talking, the students are much more engaged, partly because I may walk right over to them, so they really can't not be engaged. But I'm not going to do that here. It is true I was a political appointee for two Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and for two Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And what that really means more than anything else is that I'm actually now an extinct species. So I'm here. Before I walked in, several people came up to me and they said, "Can you give us some good news?" I said, "You do realize what I came to talk about." I think it's fair to say that if you look at the Middle East today, we probably have never seen it look the way it does right now. I'm going to talk about the book, why I wrote the book, what's in the book. We'll have a quiz about the book later on. But I would like to start just by saying a little bit about what's going on between Israelis and Palestinians right now. Many people are asking me the question, is this an intifada? An intifada basically means an uprising. Is this an intifada? There were two intifadas. There was one that began the end of 1987, and it was referred to as the Children of the Stones. That intifada was really run by what were known as the young Fatah activists who became the Tanzim. And everything, even though there was a lot of frustration at the time, it was triggered by a truck accident in Gaza at the time. Nonetheless, everything was organized. There was an infrastructure that ran things. There was a kind of underground. It wasn't run out of Tunis where Arafat was. This was done from within the territories. And there were demonstrations that were planned. There were boycotts that were planned. There were strikes that were planned. Everything was a function of organization and planning. The second intifada, which erupted at the end of September of 2000, was also something that was very much organized with a clear infrastructure. Originally, it was planned by Arafat, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you want. In many ways, it kind of took on a life of its own, but here again, there was an organizational structure that ran it. Now, Hamas was involved, the Tanzim, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, everyone who was involved in carrying out what were acts of terror, and there was a lot of bombing then, they were all affiliated with organizations. What you're seeing today is no affiliation, no organization. Even the demonstrations that you used to see in these first two intifadas, if you looked at the cities, you'd see thousands upon thousands that would appear in demonstrations, and then you'd get, and what really drove the second intifada was every time after a big demonstration, and then the demonstration would go to an Israeli checkpoint, there would be, a burst of violence, you'd get Palestinians killed, there'd be funerals, and the funerals themselves would then trigger a whole new round. What you have today, you'll see pictures in some of the West Bank cities, and you'll see 10 or 15 people be throwing rocks. This is not organized, they're not big demonstrations. There was a call for 3 days of Days of Rage by the Hamas, and the numbers of people who turned out were small. Most Palestinians, I'm not saying they're satisfied at this point, they are not. Most Palestinians at this point still remember the consequences of the Second Intifada, where 4,000 Palestinians died over a 4-year period. The Israelis lost about 1,000. And so everyone was touched by it. The economy in the West Bank today has not returned to what it was in the year 2000. You don't see at this point a kind of mass uprising that would produce an intifada. Doesn't mean it can't happen. What you're seeing right now is basically 15 to 25-year-olds, mostly in Jerusalem, but not exclusively in Jerusalem. Some Israeli Arabs, also very young. They're the ones who are doing this. They're being fed largely by social media. There may not be an organization, but there's a lot of social media, and you'll see certain videos go viral. So a Palestinian will stab an Israeli. They won't show the act of the stabbing, they'll show the result of someone who's just been killed, a Palestinian just been killed. And that in combination with one other thing. What is the overriding driver of this has been a false narrative. That what the Israelis are doing, and this is what's spread among Palestinians, what the Israelis are seeking to do to the Al-Aqsa Mosque is what exists in Hebron. What exists in Hebron, for those of you who know anything about Hebron, Abraham was father of both Jews and Muslims. And there is the tomb of Abraham in Hebron, and it is, on the one hand, you have the tomb of Abraham where Jews go to pray, and on the other hand, it's called the Ibrahimi Mosque, where Muslims go. And the narrative that's out there is what the Israelis are trying to do is to turn the Al-Aqsa Mosque into a shared facility. Completely untrue, but that has taken on a life of its own. So many of those who are carrying out acts of terror, they're saying, this is for Al-Aqsa. I'm protecting Al-Aqsa. And that, you have to basically blunt that unreality. You have to somehow find ways to make it clear that's not going to happen. And there are things that could be done. And maybe here again in the Q&A we can get into that. I wanted to set this up as a way of introducing the discussion on the book by also talking about how the Obama administration has responded to what we've seen happening right now. Some of the early statements coming out of the State Department and even out of the White House created a kind of moral equivalence. Then so they said, when there's, the Israelis shouldn't react with excessive force to stabbings. Now these were almost, in the beginnings of this, has been going on about 3 weeks. In the beginnings of this, it was exclusively civilians who were being stabbed. And there was a kind of instinct to try to qualify what we were saying in terms of condemning these acts, because there was a concern that it not look like we were coming down too hard on the Palestinians. And it reflects a basic mindset and instinct, by the way, a mindset that has existed in every administration from Truman to Obama. This is a book entitled Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama. This mindset reflected a view about how to manage U.S. relations in the region. Even though the book is about U.S.-Israeli relations, one of the things you'll see when you read it, as you all will, one of the things you'll see is that there is a kind of, there's a view of Israel that is derivative of our view of the region. Now, the constituency that, in a sense, is hesitant to be seen as being too critical of the Palestinians in the Obama administration reflects a view of the region, a view of American interests that has been in every administration from Truman until today. And I want to talk a little bit about the assumptions that guide that constituency. There comes a point where there's a countervailing constituency, and I'll get to when that emerges. And there's been a debate between these constituencies. Between the first and the second term in Obama, there's been a change in the balance between the weight of these two different groups. But I want to pose a question, because I want to reinforce this notion, first, that every administration has had, from Truman to today, has had a constituency in the national security apparatus that has tended to view Israel through the lens of being a problem. Not a partner, but a problem. So I'm going to pose a question to you. Now, I do that because this is the way I also teach. First I said I like to walk and talk when I teach. I also like to pose questions. One of the reasons is that I say to my students is, you may not always remember what I say, but I know you'll remember what you say. So I want to pose a question to you. If this constituency existed in every administration, it turns out that there was one administration where this constituency had no weight. Which administration do you think that was? Again, I'll repeat the question. I do this for my students all the time. In every administration, there has been a constituency that looked at Israel through the lens of being a problem, not a partner. But there was only one administration in which that constituency existed but had no weight. Which administration does the constituency have no influence?
Reagan.
Reagan is one guess. George W. Bush.
Kennedy.
The answer is no on Reagan, no on Kennedy, and George W. Bush is a really good guess. It is a really excellent guess. It's wrong, but it's a really excellent guess. I'm going to explain. No, Carter was just the opposite. I'm going to explain why it's an excellent guess, but why it's wrong. And I'm going to demonstrate it. George W. Bush, in his first call to Ariel Sharon after 9/11, after the president had declared a war on terror, in his first call to Sharon, which is a week later, he presses Sharon to have Sharon's then foreign minister see Yasser Arafat. Now, this is at a time when there are bombs going off in Israel. George W. Bush would not have dreamed of talking to those who were responsible for hitting the Twin Towers, but he was pressing Ariel Sharon to have his foreign minister meet Yasser Arafat at the same time that Israel was being the victim of terror. Some of you may actually even recall, and if not, you will now, Sharon initially resists this. Obviously, I tell the story of this in the Bush chapter. Sharon initially resists this, but then agrees to have Peres see Arafat. He even says for the first time at this point that Israel can accept a two-state outcome. This is Ariel Sharon saying it. He has Peres see Arafat on September 26th, and between September 26th and October 4th, there are more terror attacks within Israel, including on October 4th. And on October 4th, Sharon gives a speech where he says, Israel will not be Czechoslovakia. Don't try to appease the Arabs at our expense. This is not exactly a statement that George W. Bush appreciated at the time. Nonetheless, this happened because the weight within the intelligence community, within the State Department, viewed 9/11 as being a function of, well, we're too close to Israel and we haven't solved the Palestinian issue. Now, Bush himself evolves because the more he thinks about it, he says, well, wait, we're fighting a war on terror. They're fighting a war on terror. How can there be one standard for them and another standard for us? So he changes, and over time, Bush becomes, he doesn't come in this way, but he becomes probably one of those presidents most connected to Israel. So much so that when Barack Obama comes in, Barack Obama says, for 8 years, there wasn't any daylight between the United States and Israel, and what did it get us? It created problems for us with the Muslims. And in fact, Obama is one of 5 administrations that chooses to distance from Israel in the expectation that they will gain something from the Arabs. I'm going to come back to that, though. So I didn't answer the question, did I? Of which administration was the one administration that actually this constituency existed, but it had no weight, no influence. The answer is Bill Clinton. The reason it was Bill Clinton was because Clinton had a view that it was, when we had differences with Israel, we should sort them out, but we should sort them out in private. He believed deeply that we were Israel's only real friend in the world, and that if we somehow opened a gap between ourselves and Israel, what it would do is it would encourage Israel's enemies and it would weaken Israel's deterrent. So even though the group existed during Clinton's time, they had no influence. All right, so I'm kind of on a roll, so I'm going to ask another question. It's fun, isn't it? I mean, it piques your interest. I can see you're paying attention, so it really works. All right, so the second question. Which administration do you think was the toughest on Israel? Carter? Reagan? All right, Eisenhower. The guess up here is Eisenhower. Alan, you're right. Eisenhower was the toughest. And I'm going to explain why he was the toughest. I'm going to mention there's another administration as well, but I have to explain Eisenhower. Eisenhower comes in, and Eisenhower is convinced that Truman was influenced exclusively by political factors, the, quote, Jewish vote, because how else could you explain that he recognized the state of Israel over the opposition of his entire national security establishment, all of his senior advisors. You'll recall the so-called wise men. I mean, you're talking about George C. Marshall, you're talking about George Kennan, you're talking about Lovett, Forrestal, all the people who were responsible for shaping the institutions that would allow us to compete with the Soviet Union and build the institutions that, in a sense, structure our approach to the Cold War. Every single one of them is against the recognition of the State of Israel. They're all convinced it's going to be very destructive to our interests. There's even this extraordinary meeting on May 12th, 1948, where Truman brings in Lovett, the Undersecretary of State, and Marshall, and they're going to have a discussion about what we should do when it's clear that the Yeshiva, the Jewish community in Palestine, is going to declare itself a state on May 15th, which is the last day that the British are going to be there, and they pull out. And Truman asks Clark Clifford, who is a domestic counselor, to join the meeting, and he asks him to make the case for why, in fact, we should recognize. Now, the first thing that Marshall does is he asks the question, well, why is Clark Clifford here? And Truman says, well, because I asked him to be here. And then Clifford goes through and he makes a series of points. By the way, none of the points he makes, as I'll describe them briefly, you'll see they're all connected to national security reasons. He's not making any political arguments. So he says, look, we need to recognize them because they've created a fact. Notwithstanding the fact that the CIA and George Kennan and Lloyd Henderson had written a memo in January, and the CIA had done an assessment that they presented the day before the partition vote in the UN that said, no way can the Jews there in Palestine sustain themselves. They won't last more than 2 years. They're, basically, they can't produce a state unless we put 500,000 troops on the ground and protect them. And notwithstanding what was being claimed, here's Clark Clifford saying, notwithstanding what was predicted, they actually have carved out the territory they're winning on the ground. This is before the Arab states intervene. They're winning on the ground. If you don't recognize them, you're not recognizing what is a fact, and you're penalizing them for being successful. Point one. Point two, he says, you know, if we give in and we don't recognize because we're concerned about Arab violence, that will be read as appeasement and it will encourage more violence. Number three, if we don't live up to the fact that at least you voted for partition, and now they declare themselves a state, and we don't follow through on that, we damage our own credibility. And lastly, he says the idea that the Saudis, who are our principal supplier of oil at that point, although we're basically producing for ourselves, if you know, the idea that they're not going to sell oil, that's absurd because they can't drink it. Now, Marshall, at this point, cuts him off. And he says, he's only making political arguments. And he says, if I were to vote, and understand George C. Marshall was a career soldier before he became Secretary of State. He says, if I were to vote in the upcoming election and you recognize, then I would vote against you. Pretty extraordinary statement. Truman brings the meeting to an end. Turns out Leavitt, who was the undersecretary who was there, felt this is not the way the Secretary of State and the President should be having conversations, so he works out with Clifford that they'll accept recognition on May 15th. Marshall is asked by his staff why he doesn't object at that point, and Marshall states, well, he is the president after all. All right, so I give you the backdrop only because it's easy to tell the story, because Truman is seen by Eisenhower as having done this only because of the Jews, and he's determined when he comes in to have a very different policy. So when he comes in, there is immediately he acts and his Secretary of State act to demonstrate you're going to have a very different policy. Israel actually seeks to use water out of the Jordan River, and they suspend loans to Israel because it produces an Arab reaction. Dulles takes his first trip to the area in May. Takes a 3-week trip, and he stops in Lebanon. It's his first stop. He doesn't stop by Mount Hermon, but he goes to Beirut, and he sees the Lebanese president, and he says to him, we're going to have a very different policy, and we're going to counter Israeli aggression. I'm quoting, we're going to counter Israeli aggression. Now, at the time, this is not after 1967. This is a very small Israel. You know, there's no West Bank, there's no Golan Heights. There's a very small Israel. He says, we're going to counter Israeli aggression. And this is in Israel that at the time, its presence is denied by every one of its neighbors. It's rejected. And it's facing Fedayeen attacks, which are terror attacks across the border. And he says, we're going to counter Israeli aggression, because this is his way of showing we're going to have a balanced approach. In the 1956 Suez War, which is a war that is sort of cooked between the British, the French, and the Israelis, and again, you'll have to read the chapter to get the whole story. We oppose not only what the Israelis are doing, but what the British and the French do, and we actually author a Security Council resolution. I mean, it seems really strange for me to say this. We author a Security Council resolution that calls not only for Israel to immediately withdraw, but for every country in the world to not only put pressure on Israel, but to sanction Israel unless it withdraws immediately. And the British and the French veto that resolution. I want you to think, when was the last time they vetoed a resolution as it related to Israel? The answer is, how about never? But they do it because they were part of this plan. And Eisenhower is threatening sanctions. Eisenhower himself actually contemplates the use of American force to expel the Israelis from the Sinai Desert. He has his Undersecretary of State, Herbert Hoover, Jr., bring in the Israeli ambassador and threaten to expel them from the UN unless they pull out. And the reason it's Hoover is because Dulles, right after the beginning of this conflict, suffers an acute abdominal attack, and it turns out to be cancer, the cancer that eventually kills him. So you get a sense of who Eisenhower was, the Israelis make requests for arms from the Eisenhower administration because Soviet arms are going to the Egyptians, the Syrians, and after 1958 to the Iraqis. And the answer that the Israelis are given is, you should try to develop goodwill towards your neighbors. Now, every one of their neighbors rejects their existence. So you can get a little bit of the sense of the mindset of Eisenhower. The Eisenhower administration is clearly the toughest on Israel. But there is one administration that actually, and there's only one administration that suspends arms deliveries to Israel as a punishment. Now, it couldn't be Eisenhower because they wouldn't provide any arms to Israel. So there is one administration that suspends, it turns out to be F-16 deliveries to Israel as a punishment. Can you guess which administration that was?
Reagan.
All right, yes, the answer is Reagan. Reagan, after the Israeli attack on the Osirak reactor in Iraq, and then after Menachem Begin extends Israeli law and administration in December of 1981 to the Golan Heights, Reagan suspends F-16s. Reagan, in fact, becomes, during the siege of Beirut, he becomes very tough. He has a Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, who actually wants to break relations with Israel. Really sever relations with Israel. We don't sever relations with a lot of countries. He wanted to sever relations with Israel during the siege of Beirut. Now, what's noteworthy is when I say that Reagan is the only administration that actually suspends arms shipments as a punishment, it's also worth noting that Reagan is the administration that transforms the relationship with Israel. Prior to Reagan's time, we don't have a structure of cooperation with the Israelis. Reagan builds an architecture. He, at the end of 1983, beginning of 1984, he establishes under the rubric of the Joint Political Military Group strategic cooperation with Israel, where Israel is going to be treated as a strategic partner for the very first time. And there's an institutional structure that is created for military-to-military cooperation, for joint planning, for investing in the Israeli defense industries. Israel is allowed to use something called offshore procurement, where they can take the assistance that's coming from us after the Carter administration and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. We begin to provide Israel $3 billion a year in assistance. This, under Reagan, we actually allow Israel to take $500 million a year from that assistance and use it to buy from their own defense industries. Reagan is transformative when it comes to Israel. And what happened is that if you look at the Reagan administration, you really have to divide it when it comes to Israel into a couple of parts. The first 2 years where there are reactions and punishments because of surprises is, in a sense, a relationship that is highly strained. And Reagan even writes in his diary at one point, particularly there's a fight over AWACS, and there's an opposition. Obviously, the Israelis are opposed to it. Jewish groups are opposed to it. And Reagan writes in his diary, don't they realize they have the best friend they've ever had in the White House? Because Reagan emotionally is connected to Israel. I mean, Reagan, during World War II, did training films for the Army. In that role, he's among the first to see the videos, the films from the liberation of the death camps. And he's so affected by it that it shapes him and his attitudes forever. He tells George Shultz, when Shultz was Secretary of State, that he kept the films, even to that day, because the scenes were so horrifying, he didn't think anybody would actually believe it unless they could see the films. So for him, it creates an emotional connection. He feels a built-in need to be supportive of Israel. And yet in these first 2 years, because of the surprises, because of pressures from within, there's real strains. It changes because when the Israelis, there's a May 17th agreement in 1983 that George Shultz brokers, and George Shultz has worked out an agreement where the Israelis agree to withdraw from Lebanon if Syria will. Now, Syria, in September of '82, when the war was going very differently, and the Israelis had really swamped them when they had gone up to Beirut, had committed to the Saudis they would withdraw from Syria if Israel would get out. By May of '83, things changed. The Soviets came in a very big way, provided lots of arms, took over the Syrian air defense, provided them SAM-5 missiles, The Revolutionary Guard from Iran created Hezbollah. We lost 241 Marines in October of 1983. And suddenly what happens with Reagan is he sees the Soviets and the Syrians as part of this connection, and he goes back to his roots. And this is when he authorizes strategic cooperation, partnership. It really completely flourishes after Weinberger leaves in 1987, but the whole baseline for the relationship with Israel is set by the Reagan administration from '84 on. So even though he's the only one to ever suspend arms deliveries because of a punishment, he's also the president who transforms fundamentally the relationship with Israel. Now there's one other element in the Reagan administration that is significant and noteworthy. Until Reagan, the constituency that sees Israel only as a problem is, in a sense, the dominant one. It's really the only one in the national security establishment. But during Reagan's time, there is a constituency of experts and expertise that become embedded in the national security bureaucracy that see Israel as a partner, not as a problem. And from Reagan's time on, you have policies that sort of get thrashed out between these two conflicting kind of mindsets. The balance shifts depending upon the administration and the president. The book is very much about talking about each president's attitudes, mindset, assumptions, and what's going on with their key advisors as well. All right, so the turning point is Reagan. You have this other constituency. Now I want to describe three assumptions that are interrelated, that exist among the constituency that sees Israel as a problem. Admittedly, the third assumption is shared by those who see Israel as a partner. But what are these assumptions? And it's key to understand this because it helps to define how we look at the Middle East as a whole. And one of the things I do in the book at the end is I have a lessons chapter dealing with the implications of what we should be doing. Not surprisingly, why would you write a book pointing out the mistakes of the past unless you're going to point out how you would correct those mistakes? All right, so what are the three assumptions? The first assumption is that basically if we distance ourselves from Israel, we will gain with the Arabs. The second assumption, which is a corollary of it, a natural corollary, is if we cooperate with the Israelis, we will lose with the Arabs. And the third assumption is that you can't really change the character of this region and America's role in it unless you solve the Palestinian issue. So these are the three assumptions that guide behaviors and policies in many administrations, but certainly are what drive the recommendations of those who see Israel through this lens of being a problem. All right, so I could give you, as I said, when you read the book, as you all will, and later maybe I'll come back in a few months and we can have a quiz on it, but one of the things you'll see is I could give you chapter and verse of how each of these assumptions has turned out to be wrong and how they played themselves out in different administrations. I don't have time for that because obviously we'd be here until tomorrow. But I'm going to distill for you some examples that really stand out and sort of really give a kind of clarity to how these assumptions manifested themselves and also why and how they were wrong. The first one, I said that there's only one administration where there was a suspension of arms to Israel as a punishment. But there was one administration where there's a suspension of arms to Israel because we were trying to reach out to the Arabs. And that was the Nixon administration. And it was the Nixon administration. Nixon makes a decision to suspend F-4 Phantoms to the Israelis, but he does it in 1970 at the very moment that the Soviets for the first time are sending military personnel and troops to Egypt to, in a sense, take over their air defense. It's the first time the Soviets send their military outside of the Warsaw Bloc. And this is the very moment where President Nixon decides that he's going to suspend F-4 Phantoms to the Israelis. He's doing it because he expects that in this way he can reach out to Nasser, and Nasser will respond. And of course, when he sends his Undersecretary of State, Joe Sisko, to explain, we've suspended these, we've already announced it publicly, but he's expecting, here was a profound gesture, so there should be a response. And the response from Nasser was not interested. The pattern of distancing repeats itself over and over again. Every time we do it, we don't get something from the Arabs. The main reason is because their priorities are different. And I'll come back to that in a second. Second assumption was if you cooperate with Israel, then you're going to pay a price with the Arabs. Now, we don't sell arms to Israel until the Kennedy administration. And the first arms that we sell are Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, a purely defensive weapon system. The turmoil triggered by this, even thinking about this, but then deciding it within the administration is quite profound. The Secretary of State is Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk says if we do this, it will set a terrible precedent. And it will cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. Now, the day, ironically, that the news of this sale becomes public happens to be the same day that Dean Rusk is meeting the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. At that time, Crown Prince Faisal. He's actually the real leader in Saudi Arabia. He will soon replace King Saud. Now, does Crown Prince Faisal come in and say, you're providing arms to the Israelis? How can you do that? You're going to cause great damage. We're against this. Does he focus on that issue? Is that his preoccupation? No. His preoccupation is there's been a coup in Yemen. It's backed by Nasser. This is a threat to Saudi Arabia. It's a threat to the Arabian Peninsula. And that's the problem. 1 week later, Crown Prince Faisal sees President Kennedy. And when he sees President Kennedy, does he come in and complain and rant about the the Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Israel? No. What does he focus on? He focuses on our outreach to Nasser in Egypt, our economic assistance to Nasser in Egypt, which he says is freeing up Egyptian troublemaking capacity. They have many more resources to cause trouble in the region, shift the balance of power in the region because of our providing economic assistance. At the time, we're providing 2/3 of the Egyptian bread supply. What he asked for is American assurances and American weapons. He's not focused on Israel. He's not focused on the arms Israel. He's focused on Egypt and Nasser and how Nasser is exploiting our economic assistance to be able to change the balance of power in the region and threaten Saudi Arabia and all of America's friends. Now, in the book, I cite examples, and I say there are echoes for the future. Do you hear an echo for today? Does this sound familiar to you today? If you substitute the word Iran for Egypt, is this not exactly the conversation that the Saudis and the Gulf states have been having with us today and for the last year, particularly because of their concern that the Iran nuclear deal is going to provide sanctions relief, which means Iran will have dramatically more resources to cause trouble in the region, change the balance of power in the region? This is a rhetorical question. What does it reveal? What it reveals is our relationship with the Israelis has never been the thing that drives the behavior of our key Arab friends. Their priorities are security and survival. To the extent to which they see us as being the key to providing their security, then they're not ever going to put their relationship with us or make it dependent on what we do with the Israelis. Doesn't mean they like what we do with the Israelis. Doesn't mean that somehow, they're enthusiastic about it. What it means is they will not make their relationship with us a function of what we do with Israel. Now that should seem self-evident, but unfortunately it hasn't been for nearly any administration, including the current one. Because there's a kind of misreading of what are the real priorities of of key Arab leaders. All right, quickly I'll just wrap up because otherwise I'll overstay my welcome. The Israeli-Palestinian issue. If there is one thing that has been consistent throughout, this is an issue that everybody talks about, but it is not a game changer in the region. Now, this is coming from someone who spent the last 30 years of his life trying to solve that one. I believe it's important, but I've never felt we should focus on it because if we solve this, boy, the region's going to look great. I never believed that. I never believed if we solve this, suddenly everything is transformed with us. I never believed that either. Today, if we had divine intervention, which is pretty much what it would take right now, if we had divine intervention and this conflict was solved, it wouldn't stop one barrel bomb in Syria. It wouldn't suddenly shrink ISIS's presence in Iraq or Syria. It wouldn't stop the civil war in Yemen. It wouldn't end the existential struggle between President Sisi and the radical Islamists within Egypt. It should be done because it's the right thing to do, because a two-state outcome is the only outcome that will provide stability, at least between Israelis and Palestinians, but not because it's going to change the region. And there is this tendency, certainly when President Obama came in, I can tell you, and I show this in the chapter, when President Obama came in, his early instinct was, if we can solve this, it will transform everything. And I describe, he appoints George Mitchell on the second day of the administration because he's showing the high priority that we're going to attach to this, because he thinks this is going to change the way we're perceived. There's nothing wrong, as I said, with trying to solve this issue. We should. And there's a big mistake on this issue, or frankly when it comes to something like Syria. We have a tendency to create these binary choices. Either we will do nothing or we have to solve the problem. Well, you can't reduce your choices in diplomacy to you're going to solve the problem or you do nothing. Because if you think you can't solve it, then you'll do nothing and you have a vacuum. That's what we have today between Israelis and Palestinians, and that's what we have today in Syria, and you see who fills these vacuums. So I wrote this book because I wanted, in a sense, to show the roots of our policy towards the region, how often these assumptions have been not only wrong, but unfortunately, why we never learn lessons from it. And I'm hoping that the next administration and the next president, either he or she, will read the book, and their advisors will read the book, and they'll draw the appropriate lessons. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. You'll all see blue cards on your tables to write questions. I'll start with an article that you wrote recently in light of the Russian involvement in Syria and your view on the role the Obama administration has played on the Syria crisis. Could you please elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, I've been able to restrain my enthusiasm for the administration's policy on Syria. Look, I mean, in a sense, what I was just describing, our approach on Syria has been driven by an understandable reluctance on the part of the president to get sucked into a quagmire. Completely understandable. The legacy of Iraq clearly weighs heavily on him. The problem is you can overlearn lessons. And not every case is the same. And we don't always have to be concerned that if we get involved a little bit, this means inevitably we're on a slippery slope and we don't have control over our own decision-making process. We get sucked in and we have mission creep. Because of the president's reluctance to be involved, at every step of the way, the options available to us in Syria have become worse and worse. I described, when I was in the administration, that from the very beginning the president didn't want to get sucked in, for reasons I understood. And the president was very clear, and I quote him as saying, "We should not be involved," this is a quote now, "in somebody else's civil war." And I posed the question in this article, but what if that civil war produces a humanitarian catastrophe? What if that civil war produces a severe refugee crisis? What if that civil war destabilizes every country around it? And what if that civil war gives rise to ISIS? Not every civil war is the same. And we needed to have a response to this that took account of the strategic consequences of this, not just the humanitarian consequences of it. So I made a case for creating a safe haven. Now, I made the case for it by focusing on two issues. One was we could do it in a way that would be consistent with President Obama's instincts, which is to share the burden, and we needed to do it because we had to establish leverage, which is the only ground rule that Putin understands. I said before, when you reduce your choices to doing nothing or solving everything, or in this case doing nothing or actually having to put boots on the ground, you'll do nothing and you create a vacuum. And you see who fills the vacuum? Putin filled the vacuum. You want to affect Putin's behavior, you have to play by his ground rules. So the idea of a safe haven was, how can you staunch the refugee flow? How can you use what in fact others want us to do as a lever on them? For example, Consul General of Turkey is here, and he knows better than me. Turkey has been clamoring for the creation of a safe haven for almost 4 years. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris are as well. So I suggested we would go to them privately and we would say, we will do no-fly. Turkey, you need to put forces on the ground in the safe haven to police it so that you can't have infiltration by ISIS into it. You, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, you will pay for the infrastructure so we can absorb refugees. And you will also agree that from now on, all assistance is going to one address, one group, so that we stop what is the complete fragmentation of the opposition. And to the Europeans, who are going to be the big beneficiaries of this because it staunches the refugee flow, they have to contribute their air forces to the no-fly effort. Once you have this lined up, I said, then you go to Putin privately and you say to him, you know, don't test the safe haven, don't test the no-fly. We're not going to challenge you where you're flying, don't test this. And Putin, if you look at his behavior, Putin is a guy who actually respects limits. The problem is you actually have to establish the limits.
What is the impact of the U.S.'s lack of presence in the Middle East, and what can the U.S. do to reassert its presence in the region?
Well, I'll give you a kind of, I mean, obviously what I was just describing would be one way to do that, but again, to show you how, history often repeats itself. In the fall of 1969, when Gaddafi, in a coup, replaced King Idris within Libya, Kissinger describes how every single one of America's Arab friends at the leader level sent a message to the White House expressing their deep alarm over the fact that radical nationalists were gaining, and were gaining at their expense. And the U.S. was being passive in response to this. And the balance of power is changing. Again, sounds familiar, right? And what were we going to do about it? Now, the fact is we didn't do anything about it for a while. During what became known as Black September, we, at the time when Syrian forces came across the Jordanian border, we mobilized some forces, we sent a carrier, but we actually talked to the Israelis about mobilizing their troops and being prepared to use their air force in response. And this was largely at Kissinger's behest. Kissinger, by the way, is excluded from Middle East policy making by Nixon for the first 2 years of the administration because he feels that his Jewishness will make it very difficult for him to work with the Arabs. It's a great irony because the guy who actually, after '73, the guy who establishes relations with Egypt and with Syria is, of course, Kissinger, but that's a different issue. When the Syrians are forced to back down, because when the Syrian Air Force isn't committed, and King Hussein is able to expel them, suddenly it looks like one of our friends has won and the radicals have lost. And this begins to reestablish the image of the U.S. So I tell the story not only because it's a reminder that we've seen this movie before, but also that manifestations of American effectiveness can transform the image fairly quickly. And this was a case we didn't actually use any force at all, but we engaged in coercive diplomacy. Now, coercive diplomacy doesn't work if your threats aren't seen as being credible. Today, ever since the president didn't act on the red line in Syria, we have had a problem in the region. It's not just because of the Iran nuclear deal. The perception of us is that when you set a red line and then you don't act on it, then it raises fundamental questions about what you will act on. And I say in the book, in the Obama chapter, you should be very careful when you set red lines for two reasons. The first is anything up to the red line is seen as being permissible. And the second is once you set it, you have to act on it. And if you don't, you pay a price. And it doesn't matter whether, objectively speaking, the deal that was worked out with the Russians to destroy chemical weapons actually probably destroyed dramatically more than would have been the result if we had if we had sent in a few airstrikes. The problem is there's a subjective reality, and our word matters.
Taking that further, understanding the parallel between Egypt and Iran, However, finding a solution with Iran is important. How do we balance Israeli-Saudi views relative to Iran versus a need for improved Iranian relationship? Syria doesn't seem to be solvable without Iranian participation.
Well, today, Syria isn't solvable without Russian or Iranian participation, and both are increasing the scope of their participation, and they planned it before the deal with Iran on the nuclear question was finalized. Immediately after it was finalized, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force of the IRGC, went to Moscow, which was a violation of the sanctions regime, which the Russians are a part of. And clearly they planned and coordinated everything they're doing on the ground. The numbers of Revolutionary Guard forces have gone up significantly. It's not just the Russians who are doing it. So both of them are making it clear that they're going to be arbiters of the future of Syria. What I was getting at is, you want to affect and produce a political process in Syria, you got to play by the same ground rules that they're playing. Doesn't mean you have to do exactly what they're doing, but you got to establish you're going to affect the balance of power on the ground. All right, so back to the heart of the question. I mean, the essence of the question is, how do we reconcile what are the fears of the Israelis, the Saudis, basically all the Gulf states, and their concerns about Iran, and yet maybe do things differently with Iran? Here I would go back to, and you'll see in the Obama chapter, I described the evolution of our policy towards Iran, because I was there, and this was a major responsibility of mine in the first term. The logic of what we were doing in the first term was build pressure on Iran, but leave them a way out. That worked. That brought them to the table on the nuclear issue. It was the sanctions that made them decide that they were going to engage in a serious negotiation. You can debate whether we could have gotten a better deal or not. What is a fact is that we used leverage to produce the negotiation. Now the logic was, you raise the price to them to change their behavior in the nuclear issue. Same logic should be applied to their behavior in the region. Where they're engaging in destabilizing behavior, they should pay a price for it. If you want to empower the Rouhanis and those who are seen as being pragmatic on the Iranian side, you have to show that what Qasem Soleimani and the Revolutionary Guard are doing is costly. If they think Iran is gaining because the balance of power is shifting, they're the dominant influence in several different Arab capitals now, this is going to be seen as that's who ought to be guiding their policy. Rouhani has no influence on what the Iranians are doing in the region. You want to change that reality. One of the ways you change that reality is by making it clear that what Qasem Soleimani is doing is going to cost. You have to compete with them. Now we have all sorts of partners who are ready to compete. So work with them, and that actually is a way you build leverage on Iran to change Iran's behavior. The idea of doing this deal and that empowers Rouhani, it's one element of empowering those who are more pragmatic. You're going to see, if you look at every speech the Supreme Leader has made since the deal, has been worse. Because he's validating his ideology. And he's compensating by allowing the Revolutionary Guard to do more. You want him to change the way he sees things? Raise the cost of what the Revolutionary Guard is doing. Then you might actually produce more responsiveness from the Iranians. Right now, you're not.
It seems to me that much of the misery of the Palestinians can be laid at the feet of their corrupt and incompetent leadership. Why is Palestinian leadership not held accountable for their failure to prepare their constituency for coexisting with Israel?
Well, first, it's not new. Look, if you look at the history of the Palestinian national movement, it is a national movement that has been guided by a preoccupation with symbols rather than substance. The one Palestinian leader, the Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, who came in and said, you know, rather than focusing on symbols, why don't we build a state from the ground up? Why don't we take a page from what the Zionists did? They created the institutions of a state so that the world had no choice but to accept that there was a state. Why don't we do the same? In 2011, he laid out a 2-year plan to do this. The problem is, in the end, he was seen as stepping on too many toes on the Palestinian Authority side, and in the end, he was forced out. To be fair, the Israelis could have done much more to show his way worked, and they didn't. So partly it's that there was a lot of jealousy within the Palestinian Authority and within Fatah itself, And partly it was that he needed more demonstrations that his way of doing things actually paid off. There is a larger issue here, and I sort of described this in the Obama chapter in particular. The president looked at Israel as being strong and the Palestinians as being weak. And it goes to the heart of your question. Because the Israelis were strong, the onus was entirely on Israel, and he gave the Palestinians a pass. Now, if you have a political culture that focuses on symbols more than substance, because substance is hard, you have a political culture where you are seen as being the weaker party, which is a fact. You have a deep and abiding sense of grievance. You have a deep sense of historic wrong done to you. The very idea that you as the weaker party with all this sense of grievance should make any compromise is itself not legitimate. Now, if you're asking Palestinians, therefore, to make then big decisions and to be accountable, it's a really hard thing to do. The last thing you do under those circumstances is give them a pass. For the president, the Palestinians were too weak to criticize. But if they're too weak to criticize, they're too weak to be accountable. The thrust of what I was saying is that we need to hold each side accountable. Not one side, both sides. It's fine to hold the Israelis accountable, but you can't hold them accountable, but never hold the Palestinians accountable.
Thank you for that. Brings me nicely to the next, combining two questions here. What's your opinion of Netanyahu's positions? And do you believe Netanyahu has an obligation to attempt to end the schism in the Jewish community, which I believe he created?
Wait, what's the last part of the question?
Do you believe Netanyahu has an obligation to attempt to end the schism in the Jewish community, which I believe he believes whoever believes? Sorry.
Yeah, look, one of the things I say, even though the title of the book is Doomed to Succeed, it's not Doomed to Succeed, ? It still doesn't mean I think that the relationship is something that you take for granted that you don't have to work at. The logic of Doomed to Succeed is, on the one hand, there's ups and downs. On the other hand, there are these fundamental elements that drive us together. We share values, because Israel is the only democracy in the region. We share interests, and we share a lot of the same threats. So that drives us together. But we also have differences, and that's what I show in different administrations and how they're handled. Now, if you look at where we are today, one of the things that I think is important for Prime Minister Netanyahu is to make it very clear that he understands Israel has to be an American issue, not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It can't be a partisan issue. I mean, if it becomes a partisan issue, what's good today won't necessarily be good tomorrow. So there needs to be a focus on restoring nonpartisanship to the Israeli-U.S. relationship, number one. Number two, look, when the Prime Minister of Israel, as he did on the Iran issue, seeks to speak for Jews everywhere, well, he also has an obligation to be sure he's taking into account the views of Jews everywhere. This is an important part of, I think, Israel's relationship with the diaspora communities as well.
You had numerous discussions with Yasser Arafat. Why did he reject the peace after Ehud Barak in the year 2000? The peace offer.
Yeah. In the end, he rejected what was presented at Camp David, and then he rejected the Clinton parameters, of which I was a principal author. The conclusion I drew, I'll tell you, President Clinton, his conclusion was that Arafat couldn't be a big fish in a small pond. He felt that Arafat saw when the conflict ended, internationally, he would kind of lose his standing. People wouldn't be paying attention to him. And that's why President Clinton felt that in the end, he couldn't do it. My view was a little bit different, and I'll tell a story about it. The conflict defined him. It isn't just that he wore his keffiyeh in the shape of Palestine, literally. It's that the struggle, the conflict defined who he was. We were saying, all right, to resolve this, you actually have to end the conflict. The story I was going to tell is that I negotiated the Hebron deal. It took 2 different 23-day shuttles. At the end of the second shuttle when we had the agreement, I went down and I had dinner with him alone, just the two of us, the day after I finished, he said, "Can't you stay a while?" And I said, "No, I'm going home, and in fact, I'm going to take a vacation." And he says, "Gee, it must be nice to take a vacation." And I said, "Well, you could use one." And then he says, "Well, I haven't had a vacation since 1962. So I said, "Well, you could really use one." And then he says, and understand, like I've been practically living with the guy. There's like no one who knows him better. And it's just the two of us. And he says, "How can I take a vacation from my people?" Now there's nobody there to impress. You know, and he knows I know him. This is, I mean, talk about a completely sort of honest statement. His people, the conflict defined who he was. Suddenly we were saying, end the conflict. It was as if we were saying, end who you are. I think he could have done other interim agreements. He could have done, you know, he could have lived with agreements that didn't have a sense of permanency to him. What he couldn't live with was ending the conflict, ending the claims, ending the grievance. And our mistake, and as I include myself in this, I should have recognized that earlier. And instead of going to Camp David and trying to resolve everything, I should have made as a condition, we don't go and try to resolve everything unless each side can go ahead and prepare their public for peace. And I would have said, each has to outline in general terms their readiness to make compromise. And if you can't do that, then we'll do more limited understandings. And I didn't appreciate that enough at the time.
Wouldn't you say that is true of both parties, that the disagreement, the conflict is down to the core of identity, and that's what causes the problems? Well,
look, this is a conflict between two national movements competing for the same space. That's why the only outcome can be two states for two peoples. When I hear people saying, well, what about a one-state outcome? Well, if you think a one-state outcome is what you want, look at what you see today, because that's what it's going to look like. Look at the Middle East. There isn't one place in the Middle East today where there's more than one identity where that state is at peace. The whole state system in the Middle East is actually breaking down. And it's breaking down over a conflict between tribe, sect, and clan. So if you push for one state, what you're saying is these two national movements who have two distinctive national identities, you're saying they have to coexist in one state. It won't happen. You'll have an enduring conflict.
It being Houston, we have to end with an oil-related question.
Sure.
Are various administrations' desire to get closer to the Arab states correlated to the price of oil? And has the strategic importance of the Middle East changed or diminished for the U.S.?
That's a really excellent question. You know, one of the first, it really has two parts to it. The first part is, obviously I think oil was a major factor in terms of thinking about the region. Forrestal, who was Secretary of Defense, was dead set against accepting partition or recognizing the state. And he has this exchange where he says, don't you realize that this is all about oil? And he says, and if we're on the wrong side of this in 10 years, we'll all be driving four-cylinder cars. This is 1948 where he's saying this. But, you know, so oil was prominent. For Truman, I mean, for Eisenhower and Dulles, it was completely pivotal. They view the Middle East as being central, and they see the flow of oil from there being critical to Europe and to our overall well-being in terms of competing with the Soviets. Nixon, at one point, you know, both pre the oil embargo and post it, even after the Saudis and others lifted, I mean, he remains preoccupied with it. And if you look at the Carter administration, the way I describe it, you'll see that nothing sort of affects them more than the fear that they're going to have another oil embargo. And I sort of go through what drove that, the consequences and the like. So it is, for a long time, it's clearly very much a part of the psychology. We're in a different place today, obviously, because soon we'll be the biggest oil producer. Many people are drawing the conclusion that because of that we really don't have to be involved in this area. And the problem with that notion is it assumes, it sort of ignores first that the pathologies of this region don't tend to stay there. If you think that you can insulate yourself from it, you're dreaming. If we're not there, they'll come find us. You're already seeing ISIS, encouraging people to come here, and the idea that if we weren't, fighting them, that there wouldn't be a problem. You go back to who was kind of the intellectual, really the intellectual driver of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It was Sayyid Qutb, who actually came and spent a couple years after 1945 in the US, went back and wrote about what he saw as being our inherent corrupt nature, and that our mere existence would corrupt Islam. And so the fact that we exist, therefore, is a threat to them, number one. So the pathologies in the region won't stay there. Number two, if the supply of oil and energy somehow is fundamentally disrupted from this region, well, you have one pool of energy worldwide. So let's say you cut off 20% of what's available worldwide. Doesn't matter that we're producing it here. The price of oil again gets bid up dramatically. It affects the global economy. It affects all of our allies. Our position since the Carter administration has been we can't permit a hostile power to gain leverage over the oil supply out of this region. So what I don't see is that our interests fundamentally will change. I understand politically it becomes harder and harder to think about us being prepared to commit blood and treasure to a region where we don't have a dependency on oil the same way. But we have to realize that that one pool still exists, and the pathologies that are there won't stay there. So we have a reason to be engaged in this region, notwithstanding the changing character of the oil market.
Thank you, Ambassador.
You're welcome.
Very much.